Welcome to, this is the final session for today of the Island Finance Forum of 2024. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Stacey Alvarez de la Campa. I am the Partnerships Manager here at Island Innovation, and I'm based in Barbados, so it's a lovely warm Wednesday morning here. And I'm very happy to be presenting this session, which is called Accelerating Finance for the Caribbean Islands, which is something we're very interested in doing. And kind of seeing how we can make those financing flows, make the islands a better place and more conducive to financing. So before we begin, I would like you all to know you should see a poll appear on your screen. So please let us know where you're connecting from, the sector or industry that you belong to. And you can be sure to use the question and answer function if you do have any questions, and we'll try to address them as much as we can. This is an informal kind of 20-minute fireside chat, okay? So at this point, you should see, let's see if we see the poll appearing, the results appearing as yet. I see people joining us from Barbados. I see people from Cameroon. I'm in Barbados too, so that's good. So as I said, please feel free, use the poll, let us know. So we can see that due probably to the time, the majority of people are joining us from the Caribbean, and then that's followed closely behind that by Europe, and then we have North America joining us. So we have a nice varied audience today. So thanks so much, and I see Jamaica joining us as well. So at this point, I would love to introduce Minister Quincia Gumbs-Marie, who is the Minister of Sustainability, Innovation, and the Environment of the Government of Anguilla. Thank you so much for joining us, Minister.
Good morning to everyone from across the globe, and good morning to you, Sarah. It's a lovely speech. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great, great. Okay, so, well, I mean, we know this session is going to be all about accelerating finance. It's not just about finance, it's accelerating finance. So for you, Minister, just to get an idea of, what you think overall about financing as it relates to the Caribbean, what would you say is kind of the most important thing to bear in mind in that regard?
I mean, I often say that the front line of climate change, finance is on the back burner. And what stands between us and being able to respond and position our countries to be resilient countries in the face of climate change is the ability to access equitable finance. And finance should not just be available, but it needs to be accessible, meaning that it needs to understand where countries are. It must be an appreciation for the structures and the social structures, as well as the formal and legislative structures that we have, which may not mirror the financing country structures. So there needs to be appreciation for that, as well as identity. We have varying identities across the Caribbean. We have independent countries, we have dependent countries, and we have countries that almost sit somewhere in between, countries that cannot be held accountable for where they are in terms of the socio-political reality that they face. And so we need to appreciate that when it comes to climate change, these statuses should not really affect our access to finance. And the other main issue, I think, that's not really done, and I think throughout this session, we'll probably be touching on all of these three topics, is the fact that we have a lot of financing vehicles in the Caribbean. We have the CDB, we have the IDB, we have NGOs like the Climate Accelerator. We also have regional groups like CARICOM, OECS, and these bodies intimately understand the realities in the region. And I think that they need to be more part of the conversation of how we accelerate finance, because when I say accelerate finance, I say finance is there. How do we get it to the people that need it? So I think they are well positioned to really bridge that gap, which is sorely missing in the region.
Thanks so much for that insight, because I think you really touched on how we in the Caribbean, we're leaders in that regard to a certain extent, because you make mention of the many financial mechanisms, the many vehicles for financing that are there. And we tend to forget that. And we tend to forget that financing is indeed there, but how do we get it to those that need it? So we really do appreciate your inclusion, the overview you gave. You included, different territories. We have to make sure we include those who are marginalized and everyone who is most affected. So we do really appreciate that insight. Thank you so much, Minister. I wanted to also touch on, you mentioned financial mechanisms. So which ones would you say are most suited for growth and development in this region? Can you give some examples of those mechanisms and how they would function?
Apart from the mechanisms that I did mention, we have
Yes.
several central banks in the region, and they also be considered in the regional financial mechanisms. I think the main issue, and I can speak particularly from a niche view, which is the overseas territory view, is that we do not have access to global financing funds. It's the craziest thing to me because climate change is a global problem, and we still try to politicize our global response. And for example, in Anguilla, which is a British territory, we cannot access funds given by the UK because that would be considered giving funds to themselves. We cannot access funds by the EU following Brexit. We cannot access funds from America because they are focused on regional, independent regional countries. But when you have conversations with the regional financing mechanism bodies within the region, they do not see color. They do not see the flags and the political status as a rationale for exclusion. They also are, in some ways, the overseers of a lot of the governance mechanisms. So, for example, the CDB, they do a lot of policy-based loans where they would encourage the introduction of certain policies so that countries can access financing. So they would know where each country is at in terms of how can they manage finance that comes to their countries, and how can each country know what is the best mechanism that they can use within different countries to drive those finances to where they need to in a way that can be well governed and audited, because I know that's a big concern. And it's rightfully so. You want to make sure that the money that you send to the region is going exactly to where you expect it to go. But in the same breath, when you have most of the global funds going through funding mechanisms like the IMF and the World Bank, there's a big gap between where the region is and where they expect the region to be. And there's an Audre Lorde quote that I often use to explain this conundrum in a way, which is you cannot use Massa's tools to dismantle Massa's house. You need to be able to understand where we are within the region, and the countries that technically put us in this position we cannot be guided by their mechanism. We all have developed on different levels. We've had different experiences as countries. We've had different access to finance as countries. So you can't look at the rating of Anguilla, which is often a B or A, and look at the rating of another Caribbean country and say, well, Anguilla is actually better positioned, when the truth is we are bolstered by our UK status. So when you look at us actually comparing apples to apples, you realize that we're not the same. But our regional development banks and our regional financing bodies have an innate understanding. If you go to the OECS, who provides a lot of policy support, they would know which countries are best suited to receive financing for certain things, and they won't care about the politics. And there have been instances where they have said, Anguilla or BVI, a Montserrat, will be best positioned to receive these funds, but we cannot give it to you. And so now it is limiting the reach of what these funding bodies should be doing. And it is unfortunate, because the rules and the mechanisms by which the region should be governed by should come from within the region, because there's an appreciation for where every country is. And you won't have bodies like the IMF or the World Bank saying, oh, we understand Anguilla's position, so here's what we'll do. They will say, well, you don't meet the criteria. There's nothing we can do for you. And we're excluded. But if you really wish to develop the region, when Anguilla is hit by a storm, and let's say the UK is not in a position, or they don't feel like supporting, what happens to our neighboring countries that were not hit by the storm? We may become climate refugees. We may become pests to our neighboring countries. But that is because there's no appreciation for the fact that we are all in different places and we all deserve different solutions. And the only bodies that will care enough to appreciate where we are individually and collectively are bodies within the region who are accustomed to our different statuses.
I mean, I am really blown away in a good way by your answer. And as soon as you quoted Audre Lorde, one of my favorite writers, I was like, yes, I think what you've touched on really illustrates very vividly the way that financing can lead to a certain element of empowerment and a certain element of a way that we can individualize who we are and at the same time, find a collective identity within that as people and as a region, which I think is a good way to move forward in a way that will transmute throughout generations, because that's the thing. When you are speaking, it brings to mind a lot of the climate issues are indeed intergenerational injustices that are kind of coming together at this point when we're at the front lines of all of this. So I think that was very, very, I'm very happy that you've touched on that, Minister. Thanks so much. That was great. So, I mean, looking at the future, because we do want to think about, you have touched on what these challenges are. How do you think the future should kind of begin to evolve in terms of that way of being aware of these nuances and being aware of policy? What do you think is one of the more important policy considerations we have to keep in mind?
Well, definitely need a situation where global politics is separated from financing. And it's not just climate needs, but climate really comes to the fore when in these forums and when we talk about the region as a collective and how do we get access. Because before looking at the future, we have to look at where we are right now, where a lot of countries cannot access loans because of their loan ratio to revenue and their GDP status. And we're excluded on numbers as opposed to on ground realities. And that has been a long-standing argument across the region. Luckily, we're at a point where the multidimensional index is being touted a lot more. There's a lot of work into figuring out what should be considered and what should be excluded. And obviously I can't say for selfish reasons because I won't be 100% correct, but for the purpose of inclusion, a lot of the OTs are saying political status must also be measured by included in that multidimensional vulnerability, because there's a presumption that because you're UK or because you are France affiliated or any other country in the EU, that you have access to funds that you do not have. And that is important for not only the British overseas territories, but the Dutch territories, the French territories. And so we must appreciate that none of our Caribbean countries are actually positioned to respond to climate change and our development needs. And very often, those development needs are directly put into harm's way because of climate change. So there is a bit of a commingling of how do we as a country develop and what's worth putting money into, because there's now an argument that says put money into the intangible, put money into people, because a hurricane can blow away people. But then I would argue that when we had Hurricane Irma in 2017, that did away with 90% of our GDP in 6 hours, a lot of our people, as a result, migrated to the UK because we're UK citizens. It's very easy. Just get on a plane and you're there. And so while I can understand the argument about investing into the intangible, we need to invest in our tangible infrastructural resources. We need to invest in our coastal resilience. We need to invest in being able to respond to climatic events. So these big ticket items are also part of our budgets. And the question is, should we be taking loans to respond to that? So in the future, I think one of the best ways out for the region is to continue to champion and advocate for finances that considers vulnerability, and vulnerability that looks at how quickly a country is able to respond versus others, and not just utilizing vulnerability for accessing climate finance, but utilizing vulnerability for supporting countries and how they should go about development. Because it should not just be about how do we access finance. These mechanisms and bodies like the CDB as well can really use their resources to say, well, your development goals are such, but in terms of priorities, while politically building a school may be more politically expedient for you, here's where you should be putting the money, which would support politicians. And I think having that independent analysis done will bode well for continuity, because one of the problems that we face in the region is continuity. But then, luckily for us, across the region, I have not seen, and I'll stand to be corrected, I don't know if anyone in the comments want to talk about it, but across the Caribbean region at least, I don't see the politicization of climate change. I think all leaders across the region, no matter what party they're associated with, no matter what their fundamental differences are, have an appreciation for climate change. And so that's one of the things that we can say is a little insulated from politics that we can now put into a regional or countrywide development plan. So to help countries, I think there's a big gap in terms of what technical support we need. And that I always get a little nervous talking about technical support and assistance with technical support, because very often when you get assistance with technical support, it is what people think that you need as opposed to what you need by itself. So country-led understanding of, okay, here's where we are, here's where we should be. This is the technical support we need to get us there. As opposed to, I mean, to answer your question shortly, because I've been going on for a little bit, is we need to be able to insulate ourselves from outside definitions of our problems. And that's really what I'm getting at. Because when you talk about conservation in the region, you want to make sure there's actually a regional appreciation for conservation. Because when you talk about conservation from the UK, you're talking about purity. You're talking about no fishing, don't touch any resources,
Exactly.
just stand still. In the Caribbean, I'm talking about being able to ensure that my fishermen have a good life and they're able to provide for themselves, but it's also balanced with the environmental needs of all our regional waters. When we talk about development and underdevelopment, even those definitions are different. When we talk about finances, financing needs, those definitions are different. So as a region, we need to come together and say, here's how we solve our problems. This is actually what we are facing as a region. Here's where you come in, as opposed to the other way. And we are getting it here and there, but when it comes to finance, losing that battle.
Yeah, and I think that's really great in terms of you pointing us to see that there is a measure of autonomy and self-actualization we have to see as part of this process, because it's when people are on the ground experiencing things and we have the experts and we have the know-how, we have to be empowered to move forward with that, as opposed to, as you said, the outside, kind of embedding outside definitions of things that people take for granted, that the meaning is the same everywhere. It's actually not. So we really do appreciate your insights. You don't go on too long. This is one of my favorite sessions so far. so we appreciate your insights.
Yeah, I'm looking at the clock and I know it's 20 minutes. I'm like, oh my God, it's 19
now.
No,
that's fine. This went fast because we had such a great conversation. So, any words of wisdom that, I mean, all of your words, I think, have been words of wisdom today. Anything particular you'd like our audience to bear in mind, as a kind of a kernel of wisdom on this topic?
I think that someone asked we are a CARICOM member. I don't know if there's an answer, but Anguilla and other British overseas territories are associated members because of our status. And I think Bermuda is now trying to become a full member, and Montserrat, following their volcano, were full members. So it's kind of mixed between TCI, BVI, and Anguilla, Cayman, and such would be associated members, those of us who are actually associated. But I think in terms of words of wisdom, I have been focusing primarily on the region because, I'm from here. And so proximity makes me an expert, I guess. But one of the things that I think that has been working for us so far, is the fact that regional islands, across the Caribbean have come together and said, we all are facing the same issues. And as a younger politician, I have seen a lot of younger politicians saying, well, I feel like different regions are moving ahead of the Caribbean. Perhaps we need to come together on our own and try to bolster what we have, as opposed to continuing that this harmony that exists right now, because they're looking outward as opposed to inward. But a lot of the regional advances has happened and occurred because of the collective island response, whether it is in the Philippines or other developing islands. They have come together with small island developing states have all come together and said, we're facing all these problems the same. Our geography doesn't actually insulate us. We are all the same because of our small sizes, and we will come together to fight this battle. And I think the best way to continue to fight the battle is to fight the battle together. It may not be, some may think it's not the most important part in words, but when we get away from ourselves and we start to become insulated and say, okay, well, we as a region, we believe this way. What that does is it erodes the need for fraternity. And as a region, you may decide, okay, well, Antigua is getting more than Barbados are. Anguilla is getting more than Jamaica. So now Jamaica wants to pull away. And so it really starts to erode the value of community and the strength in numbers. And I look to a lot of the outer island states out of the region, and I'm very much inspired by how their individual advocacy has put them into a position that we have missed out on. And I think that's because sometimes we just watch to see what other people are benefiting on, and not necessarily where we have also benefited from being associated or being around or just being defined as islands. And forums like these kind of help us to realize that we are separated by states and we are separated by waters, but we are joined by colonial backgrounds. We're joined by economic realities. We're joined by political realities, scarcities and such, even culture. And it's important to recognize that the strength in the numbers of the islands is really the way out of our problems. Loss and Damage Funds was an island initiative. It was not a Caribbean islands or South Pacific Islands. It was an island, small island developing states initiative. And I know that the SIDS conference is coming up, and we will see the value of having the voice of our islands together as one. And for those who have been questioning the value of islands fraternity, it being in Antigua should really speak to the value of each island and each region having value in that association of small island states. And when we look forward to the future, I've been elected for 4 years now, and one of my biggest points of advocacy though is when we talk about islands, we need to consider states. A part of the problem that the OTs have been facing, whether it is again British or otherwise, is that very often, as much as inclusive as the small island developing state family is, we have been excluded. And it's time to recognize that our exclusion has not been to our benefit, and to really learn about our experiences, because now I have taken it up. This is my mantra. If you've listened to me before anywhere, you've known that I always speak about the plight and the fact that we stand on the periphery of the conversation on climate change, although we sit in the center of the consequences of climate change. And so we look to broadening our definition of island, perhaps looking at whether or not state is the best final S, just probably countries, so that we can ensure that all countries, in spite of their political status, are included. But otherwise, there's still value in these numbers. I think another thing that is missing when we talk about finance as well, and someone actually touched on it in the comments, is how the private sector plays a major role. In Anguilla, we don't necessarily have ESG laws at this point, but what we do is that every foreign direct investor is responsible for contributing to our island's development. And so we have social clauses in all of our memorandums of understanding. And through that, we have done environmental efforts, we've done educational efforts, we have improved our healthcare. So right now, one of our donors is upgrading all of the equipment at our hospitals, and that is their social contribution. Another would have contributed to ensuring that every public primary school student has an access to a laptop so we can improve digital literacy. One of the other initiatives would have been support in fisheries and agriculture, which is in my ministry. And they've supported us in having a partnership with the University of Florida to conduct a needs assessment, as well as to finance the responses of the needs assessment. Another donor would have contributed to ensuring that every primary school level student would have access to free breakfasts. And so we have highlighted the needs of our countries, whether it is environmental or otherwise, and said, if you're going to come here and benefit particularly from our pristine environment, then you have to contribute to our people and contribute to them in a meaningful way. Our cultural center, which is 50 years old and dilapidated, has just been demolished and now will be rebuilt to the tune of $10 million by another donor. And so we have quite a few initiatives where we include the private sector. And very often when we speak about the private sector, we speak about accessing private finance, blended finance, which of course is an option as well. But we must realize that we have created environments and pristine environments where a lot of people come to financially benefit from. And we need to ensure that our people in our communities and our environment are also financially benefiting. So into the future, we look at ensuring that we are not being taken advantage of because of the environment we offer. And we also look at the importance of keeping the community of island states.
Thanks so much for that response. And I have a couple of questions in the chat. I think there's one in particular that I wanted to focus on, in which Lawrence is asking, there have been efforts to develop a strategic development plan, but how realistic are they if they're dependent on external finance?
That is a good question. And it's something that just last year I was having a very deep discussion over, because I don't think that we have really grasped the reality and the aspiration, the gap between the reality and the aspiration. And we come up with these very lofty ideas, and no offense to the dreamers, because this is where the inspiration comes from. But how do we hold persons accountable? And one of the things I mentioned earlier is that I think the island states have been lucky in terms of the fact that we've all can agree across political lines that climate change is real, the climate consequences are real, and we need to find a way to respond to it. But then when you look to the donor countries, there are different political beliefs in terms of what are the consequences of climate change, should they be actually financing. And I think what is consistent across the donor countries is that they always find a way to define themselves out of responsibility, which is why I think that we should take ownership of definitions. And so very vague language, or they know where they would have become the cause of our reality, and they try to fight those pieces of language out of accountability. Statements that require accountability are statements, I would say, that makes you accountable, or however we just decide to define it. So I go back to something that it feels very simple. When we are doing these developing goals, when we are doing our regional development goals or island state development goals, sustainability and otherwise, they need to be underpinned by a global appreciation of the definitions. And then we should also move forward to when you make, I don't know how we would do this as yet, so this is a little bit aspirational on my side, but when countries make commitments, those commitments should live beyond political parties. So if the Biden administration makes a commitment, we want to see a reality where we say, okay, a change in administration does not change our ability to be funded. And I'm the chair of our OECS environmental ministers, Council of Environmental Ministers. And one of the things that was brought up in our last meeting is that we don't know the consequence of the US and the UK elections, if a lot of the commitments that were made at the last COP would even be held on to. And I said, I understand the consequence of a change in government, but we have seen where the same governments have made commitments and then they did not follow through on those commitments. Some of them have even stepped back. And at this point, because of lives and livelihoods and the consequences of climate change, we need to get to a point where commitments are binding. And until we get to that point, I think Lauren sort of asked the question, I don't really see us being to a point where we can say, okay, we are actually going to be fully funded. Of course, some countries are going to keep up commitments, other countries will not. And there's nothing that we can do when those countries do not. I know that there are countries who are now pushing forward with environmental justice and trying to hold countries accountable, but I think their word should also be held accountable because a lot of countries go back home and say, okay, we've gotten this commitment. We can now divert our scarce resources to something else. And then at the last minute, you find out there's been a change in definition, there's been a change in position, there's been a change in personal in choice, and now things go haywire, even if they are not bound to the full percentage of what they have offered to a country or to a region or to the islands. Whether we as a world come together and say, if you give a numbered commitment, you are bound to at least follow through on 50%, 60% of that commitment, because we understand that sometimes tragedies occur and funds must be redirected. So we want to give countries that ability to utilize those funds for internal purposes. But you've made a commitment, and the basis on which you would have made that commitment is because you are holding yourself accountable for your past. And it's important for us to move beyond just lip service because it's not work.
Yeah. I mean, I think that your message about, or the importance of regional cohesion. And also, I mean, I always say, I love also the point you made about definitions and what we say, because I always say I've stopped using the term small island developed states because I just think it paints a certain picture. And I always say big ocean striving states. So I say that we're bosses. I live on a boss, because it changes that narrative. And as you say, let's recognize that there's a way that we can make sure that people are, that entities are held accountable, that there is that sense of accountability. Because you made mention of lives and livelihoods, we have to keep those together and have a holistic approach towards it. So thank you so much.
Who says that language versus to action. So I think that our mutual love for her as a poet and an advocate really would understand what I would be saying, throughout this last 30 minutes, is that we need to hold on to language, because that's really all that we have. The language, the storytelling, our reality, that's all we have. And when we tell those stories, we need to ensure that whatever words that we use are not, skewed into anything else other than what we mean it to speak. And I think within the region, we have the gift of gab. I think we are very good artists. We tell our stories very well. And I think it's about time that those stories make their way into policies, and global policies at that.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Well, speaking, I don't want us to stop talking, but I know we have to we have to begin to wrap it. But we have to have a part 2, Minister Gumbs-Marie. I will be in touch. I think you're particularly the empowering essence of language is something that we can talk about some more. So thank you so much. I don't want the session to end, but I do have to kind of draw things to a close. And thank you all so much for joining this final session. And please remember that we are partnering with the government of Prince Edward Island to host a Global Sustainable Island Summit in Canada this year. There's going to be a 2-day in-person summit in May. And we'd also love for you to follow our Instagram @_island innovation. Make sure you include the underscore at the beginning. And thank you so much again to Minister Quincia Gumbs-Marie, the Minister of Sustainability, Innovation and the Environment, the government of Anguilla. This has been a really enriching, fantastic discussion, and it's planted seeds, I think, that we'll all think, and we hope these seeds will grow within us. So thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining.
A great time in Prince Edward.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.